Welcome to Quietly Reflective. Tonight we travel quietly into a name, not just a surname written on paper or passed down through families or carved into stone, but a name that has crossed languages, coastlines, kingdoms and centuries. McAllister. A name that begins far from Scotland with an ancient Greek word meaning defender of men, and finds its way through kings, saints, sea roads and Gaelic memory until it reaches the curved shores of Kintyre on the west coast of Scotland. This is not only a story of ancestry, it is a story of meaning, of what a name can carry when generations have come and gone, of how language remembers what people sometimes forget. So settle yourself for a little while. Let the day loosen. Let the sea come in quietly at the edge of the story. And together we will follow 3 small syllables across 3,000 years. MacAllister. McAllister, son of the defender of men. A name from ancient Greece to the shores of Kintyre. A name and what it carries. Every name carries a story. Not simply a family story, though family stories are in there, compressed and folded like a letter that has been read so many times the paper has gone soft along the creases. Every name carries a linguistic story, the journey of a word through time and across languages, changing shape as it goes, losing sounds and gaining them, being written down in one alphabet and spoken in another, travelling from mouth to mouth across centuries and continents until it arrives in the present day wearing the particular form it has now, which is not the form it began with, and not the form it will end with. The name McAllister, in all its spellings, McAllister, MacAlister, McAllister, MacAlister, and the dozen other variants that the records and the directories and the headstones and the emigrant ships' manifests contain, carries a story that begins not in Scotland, and not in the Gaelic tradition, and not even in the Norse tradition that the clan's ancestry also draws from. It begins in ancient Greece. It begins with a word that means to defend men, and it travels from there through Macedonia and Rome and the medieval Latin Church and the Hungarian court and the Scottish royal family and the Gaelic-speaking west coast of Scotland and the island of Kintyre, picking up layers of meaning and history at every stop until it arrives at the Loup on the shore of West Loch Tarbert in the 13th century, where a man called Alasdair Mòr, the big defender, the great protector, gives his name to his children and his children's children down to the present day. Tonight we are going to follow that journey. We are going to take the name McAllister apart, word by word and syllable by syllable, and we are going to trace each component back to its origin and then forward again through everything it has meant and everyone who has carried it. MacAllister. 3 syllables. Son, defender, man. A son who defends men. 3,000 years of human history in 3 syllables. Let us begin at the beginning. Chapter 1. Mac. The oldest word in the name. The first syllable is the simplest, and in some ways the most profound. Mac. It is from the Old Irish and Scottish Gaelic mac, a word meaning son. The genitive form is Mick, which is why you sometimes see names written as MacDonald rather than MacDonald in older records, the possessive form shading into the nominative over centuries of spoken use. Mac appears in the oldest Irish and Scottish texts that survive, in the genealogical records of the great dynasties, in the annals, in the poetry. It is one of the foundational words of the Gaelic languages. Its equivalent in the Welsh tradition, the other branch of the Brittonic Celtic languages that were once spoken across much of what is now Britain, is map, which became mab, and then in certain compounds, ap, which is why Welsh names like ap Rhys became Price, and ap Owen became Bowen when they were anglicised. The son word, in both branches of the Celtic tradition, was the primary way of locating a person within their family. You were not simply Seamus or Caitlin or Donal. You were Seamus MacDonald, James, son of Donald, your identity defined in relation to the man who fathered you. This is the patronymic system, almost universal across the ancient world. It appears in the Greek, the Norse, the Arabic, the Hebrew traditions with the same basic logic, adapted to the sounds and structures of each language. You were your father's son or your father's daughter, and that relationship was encoded in your name so that anyone who heard it knew immediately where you came from. In Gaelic Scotland, the patronymic tradition had a particular vitality that it retained longer than in most other European cultures. While the Norman and English tradition was moving toward hereditary fixed surnames, the family name that passed unchanged from father to son and daughter and grandchild, regardless of personal lineage, the Gaelic tradition maintained the flexibility of the personal patronymic well into the medieval period, and in some cases beyond it. You were Mac whoever your father was. Your son would be Mac you. The name changed with every generation, rooting each person specifically in their own generation, rather than in an abstracted family identity. The transition to fixed hereditary surnames, the kind of name that McAllister has become, passed unchanged from Alasdair Mòr in the 13th century to his descendants in the 21st, represents a fundamental shift in how Gaelic communities understood identity. The moment when MacAllister became the fixed family surname, rather than simply the description, son of Alasdair, is the moment when the clan system crystallised into something more like what we would recognise as a modern family name. That moment for the MacAllisters came in the 13th century. But to understand why Alasdair was the name worth fixing, why the Mac attached itself to him rather than to one of his ancestors or descendants, we need to understand the second and third syllables. Al-Ister. And for those, we have to travel a very long way from Kintyre. Chapter 2. Alexandros, a name born at Troy. The name Alexander is one of the oldest personal names in European recorded history. It appears in Homer. In the Iliad, the epic poem that is the oldest surviving work of European literature, composed in some form in the 8th or 9th century BCE on the basis of oral traditions reaching back to the Bronze Age, there is a Trojan prince whose name the later tradition renders as Paris, but who appears in Homer under another name as well. Alexandros. The name, in its Greek original, is a compound of two words, alexein, meaning to defend or to protect or to repel, specifically to keep harm away from something, and aner, the Greek word for man, whose genitive form is andros. Put them together, and you have Alexandros, the one who defends men, the protector of men, the guardian who keeps harm from those in his care. In Homer's account, Paris, Alexandros, was given this name as a title of honour. The story goes that as a young man, before the events that would start the Trojan War, he was a shepherd on the slopes of Mount Ida. A gang of cattle rustlers came and threatened his father's herdsmen. Paris drove them off. For this act of protection, for defending the men in his care against those who would harm them, he was given the honorific name Alexandros, the defender of men. This is where the name begins, in a story of protection, a young man who stood between his people and those who would harm them. A name that encoded that action, that preserved it, that carried it forward as a statement of what a person was or aspired to be. The name became hereditary among the Macedonian kings, Alexander I of Macedon, who ruled in the 5th century BCE and was one of the first Macedonian kings to engage with the wider Greek world, bore the name. His descendants bore it, and then one of those descendants, Alexander III of Macedon, born in 356 BCE, dead at 32 in Babylon, took the name and what it meant and projected it across the known world in a way that no individual has ever replicated before or since. Alexander the Great. In 13 years of continuous campaigning, he conquered an empire that stretched from Greece to Egypt, from Persia to the borders of India. He founded Alexandria in Egypt. He brought Greek language and culture to the Middle East, to Persia, to Afghanistan, to Pakistan. He crossed the Hindu Kush and the Indus and seemed to his contemporaries and to the world that came after him to be not quite a normal human being, something more than a man, touched by divinity in the way that only the extraordinary conquerors of history are touched. After Alexander, the name Alexandros was everywhere. It spread through the Greek-speaking world with the speed of the empire he had created. It spread into the Latin world as the Romans absorbed Greek culture and gave the name its Latin form, Alexander. It spread into the early Christian tradition. Several early saints bore the name, including a patriarch of Alexandria whose condemnation of the Arian heresy in the 4th century CE was one of the pivotal moments in the early church's definition of its own theology. Into the medieval world, the name travelled on multiple tracks simultaneously, through the church, through the Romance tradition that grew up around Alexander the Great and made him one of the great heroes of medieval European literature, and through the direct transmission of the classical tradition into the courts and monasteries where Latin was still read and written. And it was on one of these tracks, the track that ran through the courts of Christian Europe, that the name arrived in Scotland. Not through the Gaelic tradition, not through the Norse tradition, through a queen who had grown up in Hungary. Chapter 3. The Queen Who Brought the Name to Scotland. Margaret of Wessex was born somewhere in Hungary around 1045. Her father was Edward the Exile, son of Edmund Ironside of England, a man who had spent most of his life on the continent, in exile from the country his family had ruled, living at the court of King Stephen of Hungary. Margaret grew up in that Hungarian court, educated in the European courtly tradition, steeped in the Christian piety that would define her later life and earn her the status of sainthood after her death. In 1066, the year of the Norman conquest of England, the most transformative single event in English history, Margaret and her family returned to England. Within a few years, the changed political landscape drove them northward, and Margaret, who might have remained an obscure princess at the edge of European politics, became the wife of Malcolm III of Scotland, Malcolm Canmore, Malcolm the Great-Headed, the king who is perhaps best known today as the man who killed Macbeth and took his throne. Malcolm and Margaret's marriage was, by the accounts of the period, a genuine partnership as well as a political arrangement. Margaret was extraordinarily devout. She would be canonised as a saint in 1249 and remains the patron saint of Scotland today, her relics kept at Dunfermline, where both she and Malcolm are buried. She reformed the Scottish Church. She reformed the court. She brought the European standards of piety and culture that she had absorbed in Hungary to a kingdom that was, from the perspective of the continental tradition, peripheral and rough-edged. And she named her children. Margaret and Malcolm had 8 children who survived infancy, 6 sons and 2 daughters. The sons were named in order: Edward, Edmund, Ethelred, Edgar, Alexander, and David. The first 4 names are Old English, the names of the Anglo-Saxon royal tradition, the names of Margaret's own family line, the names of the kings of England from whom she was descended. The 5th name is different. Alexander. Margaret gave her fifth son the name that had come from Macedonia to Egypt, to Rome, to Hungary, to Scotland, by the long, slow route of the classical and Christian traditions. She brought it from the court where she had been raised, the Hungarian court where the name Alexander was known and used, and planted it in the Scottish royal family. Her fifth son became Alexander I, King of Scotland, who ruled from 1107 to 1124. His nephew became Alexander II, who ruled from 1214 to 1249. Alexander II's son became Alexander III, who ruled from 1249 to 1286, the king whose death without a male heir started the succession crisis that led to the Wars of Scottish Independence. 3 Alexanders, under whom the country, as a 19th century writer put it, spent her most prosperous days, and the death of the last was a signal for the long death feud between the northern and southern kingdoms, and all the consequent miseries. The name Alexander became, through these 3 kings, one of the most thoroughly Scottish names in the country. No longer a Greek name, no longer a Latin name, no longer a Hungarian name, a Scottish name, carrying within it the memory of the most prosperous period in medieval Scottish history and the grief of its ending. It was absorbed into the Gaelic tradition and given its Gaelic form. Alasdair, 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 the defender of men, speaking now in the language of the West Coast, the language of the sea and the islands, and the great Norse Gaelic families whose territories stretched from Kintyre to the Outer Hebrides. And it was in those families and in that landscape that the name became McAllister. Chapter 4. Somerled, the Summer Wanderer. To understand where the MacAlisters come from, you have to understand Somerled, or rather Somerled, or Somerledi, or Sorley, as the anglicised tradition renders it. He goes by all of these names in different traditions because he belonged to more than one tradition. He was a man of the boundary, a man of the threshold between the Norse world and the Gaelic world, and his name encodes that double identity with perfect economy. In Old Norse, Somerledi means summer traveller, or summer wanderer, or with the particular resonance that the Viking tradition gave to the word, summer sailor, the word that described the Norse raiders who came out of the north in the summer months, following the light, taking to the sea in the season when the weather permitted the long voyages that terror and trade both required. To be called Somerledi was to carry within your name the entire tradition of Norse maritime culture. The longship, the distant horizon, the seasonal rhythm of violence and commerce that had shaped the western edges of Britain for 3 centuries before Somerled's birth. Somerled was born around 1100, the son of a man called Gilabrichte, a Gaelic name meaning servant of Saint Bride, in a family whose ancestry was mixed Norse and Gaelic, the Gaelgaethil, the foreign Gaels, those communities along the western coast of Scotland and in the Hebrides who had absorbed the Norse settlers and the Norse culture so thoroughly over the preceding centuries that they were neither purely Norse nor purely Gaelic, but something new. His father's name, servant of Saint Bride, is itself a connection to the same tradition we encountered at Dalserf, where the church of Saint Bride stood above the water meadow where the covenanting martyr David Steele was buried. St. Bride, Bridget, was one of the most widely venerated saints of the Celtic world, her cult spreading from Kildare in Ireland across the Hebrides and the Scottish mainland. Somerled's father was her servant, and Somerled's own family would build Saddle Abbey in Kintyre, the Cistercian monastery founded by his son Ranald, on ground that had been sacred in various forms since long before the Christian era. The landscape of the MacAlisters is ancient, sacred ground. By the middle of the 12th century, Somerled had carved out a territory that no one before him had held in quite this form, a maritime kingdom stretching from the Firth of Clyde northward through the Inner Hebrides, controlling the sea routes that were the arteries of trade and power in the Western world. He married Ragnhildis, daughter of Olaf the Red, the Norse king of Man, a strategic alliance that gave him access to the Norse political structure while he continued to build his Gaelic power base. He defeated the King of Man in a night sea battle in 1156, dividing the island kingdom between them. He held his territory against the Scottish crown, maintaining a relationship with King Malcolm IV that was tense and negotiated rather than submissive. He took Iona, the sacred island of Columba, into his orbit, and his family would make it their burial ground. The Lords of the Isles interred on the most sacred soil in Scottish Christianity, the island where the conversion of Scotland began in the 6th century. And then, in 1164, Somerled made the decision that killed him. He invaded the Scottish mainland. He sailed up the Clyde with a fleet. The accounts vary in the numbers, but all of them describe a force large enough to threaten the kingdom's central power, and landed near Renfrew, where he intended to press his territorial claims against the Scottish crown. He was killed there. The circumstances are disputed. Some accounts say he was murdered by a member of his own household, a treacherous kinsman who stabbed him before the battle was properly joined. Others say he died in the fighting itself. The Irish annals, with the spare directness of medieval chronicle, record simply that Sorla MacGillibrick, Ri Inchagol, king of the Hebrides, was killed. He was buried, by tradition, on Iona, where the summer wanderer finally stopped wandering. And his descendants, his sons and his sons' sons, the vast network of the clan Sorla, the family of Somerled, divided the kingdom between them and spent the next 2 centuries building their own dynasties from its pieces. From Somerled's son Ranald came the MacDonalds and the McCrorys. From Somerled's son Dougal came the MacDougals. And from Ranald's son Donal, founder of Clan Donald, came, eventually, in the next generation, the man who would give the MacAlisters their name. Chapter 5. Alasdair Mòr, the Great Defender. Alasdair Mòr, the Great Alexander, the Big Defender, the significant Alasdair, and in 13th century Gaelic Scotland, for a man to be called Mòr, great or big, was not simply a physical description, but a social one. It meant that he was notable, that among the many men of his time who bore the name Alasdair, and by the 13th century, 3 generations after Queen Margaret had planted it in the Scottish royal family, the name had spread widely through both the Gaelic and the Scots-speaking populations. This particular one stood out. He was the son of Donal, the founder of Clan Donald. Wait and consider what that means. Donal was the grandson of Somerled. Donal's son, Angus Mòr, was Lord of Islay, one of the most powerful figures in the Hebridean world of the mid-13th century. And Donal's other son, Alasdair Mòr, was the man from whom the MacAlisters take their name. The MacAlisters are, therefore, the earliest branch to have separated from Clan Donald. Not a junior branch, not a distant cousin line, but the direct split from the main stem. The children of the brother of the Lord of Islay, descended in the same male line from Somerled himself through the unbroken chain of Donal and Ranald and Somerled. What do we know about Alasdair Mòr, the man? The documentary record is thin, as it always is for figures of this period who were powerful in a regional sense, but left their traces in local records rather than in the national chronicles. He appears in 1253, witnessing a charter by his brother, Angus Mòr, to Paisley Abbey. This is his first appearance in the written record, a charter witness, present at the moment when his powerful brother made a grant to one of the great religious houses of the Clyde Valley. He is next recorded in the Irish Annals in 1299. In that year, the Annals record, He was slain. 46 years of documented life, bounded by a charter witness and an obituary. But the obituary contains one detail that the annalists considered worth recording. In 1299, Alasdair Mòr was noted as a man of hospitality and excellence. Hospitality and excellence. These are the two qualities that the Gaelic world most valued in a chief and a man of standing. Not simply military prowess, though that was assumed. Not simply political cunning, though that was required. Hospitality. The willingness to give, to share, to keep the table open and the fire lit for whoever came to your door, to demonstrate your wealth and your generosity in the way that Gaelic society expected of its leaders. Excellence. The quality of being outstanding in those things that mattered, in judgment, in counsel, in the arts of leadership that held a community together. A man of hospitality and excellence. And then he was killed in a conflict with the MacDougals, the other great dynasty descended from Somerled, the descendants of Donegal, cousin enemies of the MacDonalds, occupying the same western seaboard and competing for the same resources and the same dominance. He was killed by his own kin in the internecine violence that was the shadow side of the Clan Sorla's history. And his 5 sons, Domhnall, Gofre, Donnacha, Owen, and Echen, inherited his name and his territory and his designation as the sons of Alasdair. MacAlister, McAllister. The name was now fixed. Chapter 6. The Loup, a curved shore. The MacAlisters settled in Kintyre. Kintyre, Kintyre in Gaelic, the head of the land, is a peninsula, barely that, a long arm of Scotland's west coast stretching southward into the Irish Sea, so narrow at its northern end that Robert Bruce is said to have had his galley dragged overland from West Loch Tarbert to East Loch Tarbert, a distance of less than a mile, to fulfil the letter of an agreement that his enemies thought was safe because it specified he must sail round the peninsula. He dragged his ship across the land and said he had sailed round Kintyre. Whether this is literally true, it captures something essential about the peninsula's character. It is a place where the sea presses in from both sides, where you are never far from the water, where the land itself feels like an extension of the maritime world rather than a refuge from it. The main branches of the MacAlister clan settled at 2 points on Kintyre's western shore. The MacAlisters of Tarbert held the castle at Tarbert on Loch Fyne, a natural harbour at the meeting point of East and West Loch Tarbert, one of the most strategically significant positions on the entire west coast. Robert Bruce had built a castle there, recognising the same thing that every ruler of the western seaboard had recognised before him, that whoever controlled Tarbert controlled the passage between the Clyde and the Hebrides. The MacAlisters of Tarbert served as constables of Tarbert Castle for over 300 years, from the late 15th century until 1706. The other branch settled at a place whose name is a piece of pure Gaelic geography: Loup. The MacAlisters of Loup, the Chiefly family, the ones whose line has been confirmed by DNA testing to descend in direct male line from Somerled himself. Their seat was on the south shore of West Loch Tarbert, in a territory defined by its shape. Loup comes from the Gaelic loup, or lab, depending on the spelling tradition, meaning a curve or a bend, a curved shoreline, the kind of bay that the Gaelic landscape tradition was precise about naming, because the shape of the bay determined how it could be used, whether a boat could shelter there, whether the approach was safe in different wind conditions, whether the shore was suitable for landing in different states of the tide. The MacAlisters of Loup took their designation from the shape of their shore. This is exactly how Gaelic place names work,
Not the grand mythological names of later landscape traditions, not the commemorative names that honour kings and battles, but the precise, functional, observational names of people who lived close to the land and needed to communicate specific geographical information about it. The curved shore, the black headland, the rowan tree hill, the ford where the water runs shallow, names that are instructions as much as identifications.
The first MacAlister to be formally designated as Chief of Loup appears in the records in 1366. Ranald, son of Alasdair, holding his lands in the territory whose curved shore gave his family their designation. In 1481, Charles McAllister was appointed Steward of Kintyre by James III, an administrative role that gave him authority over the management of the royal lands in the peninsula and a substantial grant of additional territory. The same year, he was made Constable of Tarbert Castle. The MacAlisters, in the latter part of the 15th century, were at the peak of their formal power within the structures of the Scottish Crown. And below their shore, the waters of West Loch Tarbert moved through the curved bay, as they move still. The Loup, unchanged by everything the centuries have brought to the land above it. Chapter 7. The Spelling Problem. A Name in Many Forms. Before we go further into the history, I want to address something that anyone who carries this name, or who has tried to trace it in parish records and emigrant lists and census returns and graveyards, will have encountered at some point with a mixture of frustration and fascination. The spellings. McAllister, 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 MacAlister, Alison, Alison. Alexander is a surname in its own right, and several others that the records have produced in the centuries since the name was first written down by people whose relationship to Gaelic orthography ranged from careful to approximate. This is not unusual. The Anglicisation of Gaelic names was a process of considerable imprecision, conducted over several centuries by a succession of parish clerks, census enumerators, ship's captains, immigration officers, and others whose interest was in recording a sound they heard spoken, and whose tools were the English alphabet and their own best guess. The core problem is phonological. The Gaelic Alasdair has 4 syllables in its fullest pronunciation: al, as, dare. The English ear, hearing this, made several different guesses about how to write it. Some wrote Alasdair, which is accurate but looks strange to an English-speaking reader. Some wrote Alasdair, getting the ending wrong but the middle right. Some wrote Alister, dropping the middle syllable entirely and landing on something that looks more like an English surname. Some wrote Alexander, going back to the Latin original entirely and dropping the Gaelic form. The Mac prefix generated its own variation. Mac versus Mike is not a clan distinction or a nationality distinction, despite the folk belief that Mac is Scottish and Muck is Irish. Both forms are found in both countries, and both simply represent the same Gaelic word written with or without the letter A after the M. The capital C in Muck and the capital A in Mac are both attempts to signal that the prefix is a separate element from the name it attaches to, not an integral part of a single word. The double L in MacAlister versus the single L in MacAlister reflects the variability of the name's third syllable. The sound is slightly different in different dialects of both English and Gaelic, and different recorders heard and represented it differently. What all these forms have in common, the thread that runs through McAllister and MacAlister and McAllister and Alison and all the rest, is the same root. MacAlister, son of the Gaelic form of the name that Alexander gave to Scotland through the 3 kings that Queen Margaret's naming choice created. When you meet someone named McAllister in an American city, or McAllister in an Australian suburb, or Alexander in a Scottish lowland town where the Gaelic prefix was dropped entirely as the family moved from the west coast to the east in the early modern period, you are meeting someone whose name contains, somewhere in its history, the same Greek word that described what Alexander of Troy did on the slopes of Mount Ida. He defended men. The name remembers it, in every spelling. Chapter 8. Among the Gael, What the Bloodline Carries. In the early 21st century, a DNA study was conducted on the claimed male line descendants of Somerled. The study focused specifically on the Y chromosome, the genetic material passed in an essentially unchanged form from father to son, generation after generation, the biological equivalent of the patronymic name. Just as McAllister is a linguistic record of descent, the Y chromosome is a genetic record, and the two can be tested against each other. Does the DNA of the people who claim descent from a particular ancestor actually show the pattern of shared Y chromosome that such descent would produce? In the case of Somerled, the answer was yes. The DNA testing confirmed that the MacAlister of Loup family, the chiefly line of Clan MacAlister, does indeed descend in direct male line from Somerled. Not from a figure whose existence is disputed or uncertain, not from a legendary ancestor who may or may not have been historical, from Somerled MacGillibricht, who died near Renfrew in 1164, whose name means summer wanderer, whose mixed Norse Gaelic identity makes him one of the most fascinating figures in the history of the British Isles. The Y chromosome analysis further suggested that Somerled's paternal line, the male line stretching back before him, showed Norwegian ancestry. The specific genetic marker, a subgroup under R1A, is estimated to have formed around 966 CE, with the most recent common ancestor of the tested descendants living around 1266 CE. The dates align with the timeline of Norse settlement in the Western Isles. What this means, in the most literal possible biological sense, is this. The MacAlisters carry in their cells the genetic signature of a man who came from Norway, probably sometime in the 9th or 10th century, and whose male line descendants became the mixed Norse Gaelic culture of the Gael that produced Somerled, and through Somerled, the entire clan Sorla. Mac, the Gaelic prefix for son. Alasdair, the Gaelic form of the Greek name for defender of men. And in the Y chromosome, the Norse sailor who came to the islands before any of this was named. 3 layers of identity in a single name. 3 layers in a single gene. The Gael, the foreign Gaels, the people of mixed Norse and Celtic ancestry who occupied the Western Isles and the Kintyre Peninsula from the 9th century onward, are one of the most historically underappreciated communities in Scottish history. They were neither Norse nor Gaelic in any pure sense, but something produced by the meeting of the two. A maritime culture with roots in both traditions, speaking a form of Gaelic that had absorbed Norse vocabulary for all the things that Norse culture brought. Boat-building terms, navigation terms, weather terms, the technical vocabulary of the sea, while maintaining the Gaelic cultural framework of the patronymic name, the clan structure, the oral tradition of poetry and history that preserved identity across generations. Somerled was their most powerful expression. The MacAlisters are part of his legacy. The sea that shaped both of them is still there, moving through the same waters off Kintyre that Somerled's galleys crossed in the 12th century, that the MacAlister chiefs looked out at from the curved shore of the Loup. Chapter 9. The Troubled Centuries. Violence, Loyalty, and Survival. The MacAlisters, for most of their history as a named clan, lived in interesting times. The phrase is, of course, meant as a curse, and the 14th, 15th, 16th and 17th centuries in Kintyre were cursed in exactly this way: interesting, eventful, dangerous and frequently violent in ways that the record captures with unsparing directness. The clan maintained its close association with the MacDonalds, the dominant power in the Western Highlands and Islands, the Lords of the Isles, whose lordship the MacAlisters had supported from its earliest days. This association brought benefits: the shelter of a powerful alliance, access to the military and political resources of the greatest Gaelic dynasty in Scotland. It also brought costs. When the lordship of the Isles fell, as it fell spectacularly and repeatedly from the late 15th century onward, the MacAlisters fell with it. James IV of Scotland suppressed the lordship of the Isles in 1493, forfeiting the title and absorbing its territories into the crown. Tarbert Castle, which the MacAlisters of Tarbert had held as constables for over a decade, became a royal naval base, used by James IV during his campaigns to enforce his authority over the Western Highlands. The MacAlisters adapted. They had always been pragmatic. The internal history of the clan in the 16th century contains details that belong to the tradition of dark Gaelic domestic drama that the period specialised in. In 1572, the chief, John McAllister, was ordered by an Act of Parliament to deliver hostages for the security of his peaceable behaviour. This is the Parliament's way of saying that John McAllister had been causing trouble, and that the government did not trust him to stop without collateral. In 1598, Godfrey MacAlister of Loup, who had become chief at a young age in 1587 and had been placed under the guardianship of his kinsman, Charles McAllister of Tarbert, arranged for the murder of his guardian. The reason given in the accounts is a romantic dispute. Godfrey had fallen in love with a young woman, and Charles had prevented the match, wanting to secure her for one of his own sons. Charles fled when he realised Godfrey knew. He was found and killed. His sons were besieged in their house. In 1600, the island of Arran was invaded by the MacAlisters, who seized the house and estates of a man named John Montgomery of Skelmorley and plundered his possessions to a value of 12,000 Scots pounds. In 1603, Archibald McAllister of Tarbert led 1,200 men to raid the island of Bute, ravaging the possessions of the Stuart family on the island. These are not the exploits of a settled, peaceful clan. They are the record of a community operating by the rules of a society in which the formal structures of the state, the courts, the law, the parliament, were still new and imperfectly accepted tools for managing conflict, and in which the older tools, the raid, the feud, the siege, remained the first resort of men who had grown up in a tradition where personal honour and clan solidarity were enforced by personal violence. This is not a moral judgment, it is a description. The MacAlisters were neither unusually violent nor unusually peaceful by the standards of their time and place. They were a West Coast clan operating in the tradition of the Clan Somerled, and that tradition was robust. The motto of the clan is a single word: Fortiter, boldly. It does not elaborate. It does not need to. Chapter 10. Ireland. The name crosses water. The sea between Kintyre and Antrim is approximately 12 miles wide. At its narrowest point, the gap between Scotland and Ireland is not much wider than the gap between the Scottish mainland and Ailsa Craig, the rock in the Firth of Clyde with which this series of narrations began. On a clear day, from the southern tip of Kintyre, you can see the coast of Ireland. On a very clear day, you can see individual features on the Antrim coastline. For the Gael communities of the Western Isles and Kintyre, this proximity was not a barrier but a bridge. The same maritime culture that had its roots in Norse and Gaelic traditions had been crossing that 12 miles of water in both directions since before recorded history. The Scotti, the people whose name eventually gave Scotland its name, came originally from Ireland in the 5th and 6th centuries, establishing Dal Riata on both sides of the water. The cultural and linguistic connection between the Gaelic-speaking communities of Kintyre and the Gaelic-speaking communities of Antrim was still vivid and active in the medieval and early modern periods. The MacAlisters went to Ireland. Owen McAllister, Owen Dhu, Black John, whose Gaelic name MacIan Dhu became the clan's secondary designation that the chiefs still carry today, served as a Galaglas warrior in Antrim in the 16th century, fighting for the MacDonald clan of Antrim, who were themselves closely related to the MacDonalds of Scotland. The Galaglasses were a distinct warrior class in medieval Ireland and Scotland, heavily armed infantrymen, drawn primarily from the Norse Gaelic families of the Western Isles, who hired their military services to Irish lords and fought in the wars of Gaelic Ireland against the English and against each other. They were the professional soldiers of the Gaelic world, trained, equipped, and experienced in a tradition of warfare that the Irish lords could not sustain from their own populations. Owen McAllister was, by contemporary accounts, esteemed as a Galaglas warrior, more esteemed, the record says, than Sorley Boy MacDonald himself. That is high praise. Sorley Boy MacDonald, Sorla Bydd, yellow-haired Somerled, whose very nickname echoes the founding ancestor of the entire Clan Sorla tradition, was one of the most famous warriors in 16th century Ireland, the chief who managed to resist the Elizabethan military campaigns in Ulster with a tenacity that made him a legend. For a MacAlister to be ranked above him was remarkable. Owen McAllister's service was rewarded with Kinbane Castle on the Antrim coast, a white headland fortress jutting into the sea, visible from the Kintyre coast on a clear day. He was killed in 1571, fighting alongside Sorley Boy against the Carrickfergus garrison. His descendants remained in Ireland, which is why the name MacAlister, in its Irish spelling, with the double L and the MC prefix that the Irish tradition favoured, is found in Antrim and the surrounding counties to this day. The MacAlisters who crossed the 12 miles of water in the 16th century took the name with them and planted it in Irish soil, where it has grown separately from the Scottish line ever since. The same name, the same Greek root, the same summer-wandering Norse Gaelic ancestry, on both sides of the narrow sea. Chapter 11. The Jacobite Sunset. Bonnie Prince Charlie's borrowed kilt. The MacAlisters of Loup were Jacobites. This should not surprise us. The family had maintained its close association with the MacDonalds through centuries of political turbulence, and the MacDonalds were among the most committed of the Jacobite clans, loyal to the exiled Stuart line, resentful of the Protestant succession that had displaced them, willing to risk everything for the restoration of a Catholic king who was more symbol than reality to most of those who fought in his name. The MacAlisters of Loup never wavered from their Jacobite leanings. The MacAlisters of Tarbert, who held their lands from the Earl of Argyll, the great Campbell Earl who was firmly Hanoverian, were on the other side, a division within the same clan that reflected the fault lines of the entire political world of early 18th century Scotland. The MacAlisters did not fight at Culloden in April 1746 as a clan, though 7 of the name are recorded among the MacDonald contingent in that last and most catastrophic engagement of the Jacobite cause. But the connection to the event that followed Culloden is something more intimate than a battle roll. Prince Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, the young pretender, the man for whom so much blood had been spilled and whose cause had just been destroyed in 45 minutes on a Dromossie moor, was a fugitive. For 5 months after Culloden, he moved through the Highlands and the Islands, hiding from the search parties that covered the country looking for him, sheltered by a network of loyal Gaelic families who risked their lives and their properties to keep him alive. The government had put a price of £30,000 on his head, a sum large enough to set up a family comfortably for several generations, and not one person took it. The famous episode of Flora MacDonald, who dressed the prince as her Irish maidservant Betty Burke and smuggled him by boat from South Uist to Skye under the noses of the militia, brought him to the island. And on Skye, in the house of the MacAlisters, Prince Charles Edward Stuart sheltered. Flora MacDonald was the sister-in-law of Anne McAllister, whose husband, Ranald McAllister, was the factor, the estate manager, on some of the MacDonald lands in Skye. The prince came to the McAllister house. He was fed and sheltered and kept safe while the search continued outside. And when he left in a kilt. Ranald McAllister's kilt. The record of this moment is preserved in the Kingsborough documents, which can be seen today at the Clan Centre at Glenbar Abbey in Kintyre. The young prince who had marched his Highland army to Derby and retreated back to destruction, who had watched his cause ended on the moor at Dromosey, who had spent 5 months cold and hunted through the islands of Scotland, wore a McAllister kilt out of a McAllister house on Skye. The clan motto says boldly, "In the house on Skye, the boldness was the family's. They sheltered a man they knew was being hunted, they fed him, they gave him clothes, and they said nothing." Chapter 12. The Diaspora, Where the Name Went. The MacAlisters of Loup sold their Kintyre lands in 1795. The sale was to pay off debts, the standard story of Scottish landed families in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when agricultural improvement and the disruption of the traditional Highland economy were combining to make the old patterns of land ownership unworkable for families whose income had been calculated on assumptions that no longer held. The curved shore of the Loup, where the Chiefly family had lived since the 14th century, passed into other hands. The family moved to Ayrshire, where they had acquired the Kennox estate through an earlier marriage. The current chief, William McAllister of Loup, lives in England. His father served in the Falklands War of 1982. The MacAlisters of Tarbert went bankrupt in 1746, the year of Culloden, the year of catastrophe, and lost their lands. The MacAlisters of Glenbar, who had made their fortune with the East India Company in the 18th century and purchased many of the Kintyre lands that the Loup and Tarbert families had sold or lost, continue at Glenbar Abbey, which now houses the clan centre. But the larger story of where the name went is not the story of the Chiefly families. It is the story of the ordinary men and women who bore the name MacAllister and took it with them when the world of Kintyre and the Western Highlands changed beyond the possibility of remaining. They went to the lowlands first, the Alexanders of Menstrie, a branch of the clan that moved from the Gaelic west to the Scots-speaking lowlands in the early 14th century and anglicised their name entirely, dropping the Mac prefix and simply keeping the Alexander. One of these, Sir William Alexander of Menstrie, became the first Earl of Stirling in the early 17th century, was tutor to the sons of James VI, and was granted the lordship of Nova Scotia in a scheme to promote Scottish colonisation of the Canadian Maritimes that proved financially ruinous but gave Nova Scotia its name. They went to Ireland, as we have seen, following the warrior tradition of the Gallaglasses and the proximity of the Antrim coast. They went to Ulster with the plantation, the Scots-Irish settlers who moved to the north of Ireland in the early 17th century and whose descendants became the backbone of Ulster Protestant culture. Many MacAlisters in Northern Ireland today descend from this movement. And they went to the world, to North America in the great waves of 18th and 19th century emigration, to Australia and New Zealand, where the ships took the dispossessed and the adventurous and the simply desperate from the Scottish ports and set them down on the other side of the earth, to South Africa, to Canada, to Argentina, to wherever the 19th century's extraordinary human migrations carried the people of the Scottish western coast. The name MacAllister, in all its spellings, is now found in every country where people of Scottish or Irish descent have settled. In the United States alone, the surname McAllister, in various spellings, is carried by hundreds of thousands of people, most of whom do not know that the al in the middle of their name is the echo of a Greek word that meant to defend, and that the Mac at the beginning is a Gaelic word that meant son, and that the whole name was given to a family in Kintyre in the 13th century by a man who was the great-grandson of a Norse Gaelic warlord who died on the banks of the Clyde in 1164. The summer wanderers' descendants, scattered across the world, still carrying the name. Chapter 13. The name in the present, 3,000 years in 3 syllables. I want to return for a moment to the name itself, MacAllister. We have followed the first syllable back to the oldest Gaelic texts, to the fundamental word for the relationship between father and son, to the patronymic tradition that is one of the oldest ways human beings have had of locating themselves in the world. We have followed the second and third syllables back to Homer, to a Trojan prince who defended his father's herdsmen on the slopes of Mount Ida and earned an honorific that became one of the most widely used names in human history. We have followed it from Macedonia to Egypt to Rome to Hungary to Scotland, carried by a saint queen who planted it in the Scottish royal family and watched it bloom into 3 kings under whom the country spent her most prosperous days. We have watched the Greek name become Gaelic, Alasdair, the defender, given to a man in 13th century Kintyre who was noted for his hospitality and excellence and was killed by his own kin in the constant grinding violence of the Western Highland world. And we have watched his name become his children's inheritance, and his children's children's inheritance, and the inheritance of a whole community that spread across Kintyre and into Ireland, and eventually across the entire world, taking 3 syllables with them wherever they went. There is something in this that I find genuinely moving, and I want to be precise about what it is, because it is not simple nostalgia, and it is not romantic nationalism, and it is not the comfortable myth that all names have a single clear origin and a straight line of transmission. What moves me is the complexity. The McAllister name is Greek and Latin and Gaelic and Norse, all at once. It was carried to Scotland by a Hungarian-raised queen and absorbed into the Gaelic tradition, and then filtered through the Norse Gaelic world of the clan Somerled before it became the specific designation of a specific man on a specific curved shore in Kintyre. It then went to Ireland, and to Ulster, and to America, and to Australia, picking up local pronunciations and local spellings at every stop, until the name in any particular place today reflects not just the 3,000-year-old Greek word, but the entire journey from Kintyre to wherever that person stands. Every spelling is a layer of that journey. Every variation is a record of a crossing. The Clan McAllister's plant badge is heather. Heather, the plant of the open moorland and the hillside, the plant that turns the Scottish uplands purple in late summer, the plant that is so thoroughly associated with Scotland in the popular imagination that it has become almost a cliché. But it is also, and more accurately, a practical plant, hardy, deep-rooted, capable of surviving in poor soils and exposed conditions that would defeat more delicate vegetation. Heather does not require good conditions to persist. It requires only enough light, enough water, enough root hold in the rock, and it will cover a hillside. The McAllisters chose it, or it chose them. A family that has been on the margins of the great events of Scottish history, not always the dominant power, not always on the winning side, operating in the shadow of the MacDonalds, and then the Campbells, and then the Edinburgh government, but persistently there. Rooted in the curved shore of the Loup, in the castle at Tarbert, in the house on Skye where a fugitive prince wore a borrowed kilt, in the family farms of Antrim and the emigrant ships to Nova Scotia, and the census returns of New South Wales and the phone directories of 1,000 American cities. Still there, still McAllister, still carrying the name. Epilogue. The name tonight. It is night now, on the west coast of Kintyre. The sea moves through the curved bay of the Loup, as it has moved since before anyone called it the Loup, since before anyone lived on its shore, since before the MacAlisters came down from the hillside to the water's edge and looked out across the Sound towards Arran and the Irish coast beyond. The water does not know the name MacAllister. It does not know any names. It simply moves and has always moved, and will move long after the last person who carries the name has added their own particular layer to its 3,000-year history and passed it on or let it end. Somewhere in the world tonight, in Scotland, in Ireland, in America, in Australia, in Canada, in the dozens of countries where the emigrant ships of 2 centuries deposited their cargo of dispossessed and hopeful Scottish and Irish families, someone called McAllister or MacAlister or Alexander is going about their life without thinking about any of this. Without knowing that the Al in the middle of their name was a Greek word that described a Trojan prince's act of protection 3,000 years ago. Without knowing that it came to Scotland in the naming choices of a Hungarian-raised queen in the 11th century and was adopted by the Gaelic tradition and was given by a powerful man in the 13th century to his children as his most enduring legacy. Without knowing that the Mac at the beginning is one of the oldest words in the Gaelic languages, a word that has been connecting parents to children in the same tongue since before Scotland was Scotland. Without knowing that the Y chromosome they carry, if they are a male descendant of the Loup line, contains the genetic signature of a Norse sailor who came to the islands 1,000 years ago and whose great-great-grandson was called the Summer Wanderer and died beside a Scottish river while trying to build a kingdom that would hold both the Gaelic and the Norse traditions together. They do not need to know this. The name carries it for them. That is what names do. That is what names have always done. They carry what we do not have the space, or the time, or the knowledge to carry consciously. The accumulated weight of everything that happened to the people who bore them before us, compressed into a sound, into 2 or 3 syllables that take a second to say and contain 10 centuries of human movement and survival and adaptation and occasional moments of pure, uncomplicated courage. McAllister, son of the defender of men, a Greek word in a Gaelic form given to the great-grandson of a Norse Gaelic warlord by a family that came from Kintyre and went to the world. The sea is moving through the curved bay, as it always has, as it always will. Thank you for listening to this first-of-its-kind narration from Quietly Reflective. This has been a slightly different journey for us, a quieter walk through language, ancestry, memory, and the long story carried inside a single name. If this style of narration spoke to you, or if you have a Scottish clan name, family name, place, or story you would like us to explore in future, your comments and suggestions would be very welcome. These stories grow through listening, through memory, through the names we carry and the histories we slowly begin to understand. So, wherever you are tonight, thank you for spending this time here. Take care of yourself. Rest well. Until next time, this has been Quietly Reflective. Quiet thoughts for a noisy world.